morning in Perth, exactly 12 hours ahead. And good evening here from the United States. We are very pleased to welcome all of our guests here in New York and in Perth. I'm John Barry, the head of the American-Australian Association here in New York. And when I was last in Australia, I got to meet the new executive director of the General Sir John Monash Foundation, Anne-Marie Rolls, and we decided it would be a wonderful project if we could connect our fellows with the Monash fellows and take on various topics that we could discuss together. We are going to be also beaming this not only through the mechanisms that we have here, but through Facebook, and it will be available online afterwards. The topic that we agreed on for the day is energy in the 21st century. What challenges, what innovations, what promises lie before us. Each of you have studied in this area and have come at this from many different angles. The format that we're going to use is we will give each of the fellows about 3 to 4 minutes to go through their work, their study. We'll kick off here in New York with our two, Alexander Smith and Ryan Edwards. Each of the biographies, rather than use, because we're very much limited to only 1 hour in terms of our time that we have available this evening. And so I will, rather than repeat everyone's biographies, I will refer you online to those so that you might find how interesting each of these fellows are. With that, let me turn to Anne-Marie to help kick us off, and then we'll get to work.
Thank you very much, John. I just want to say a very warm welcome to this wonderful turnout of friends and supporters in New York. It's very, very special to be here. And welcome to everybody in Perth, and thank you all so much for taking the time and having the commitment to get up so early in the morning to participate in this inaugural Scholars Forum. We hope this will be the first of many, although we might try and make it less complicated for the wonderful team here in New York. I just want to say a very special thanks to Jalen and Melanie and Luke, who have done an outstanding job. We have harangued and harassed and spoken to them at the most ungodly hours on many inappropriate days. So really appreciate their dedication and the incredible hard work they've put into things. And also to Deborah and the wonderful team in Melbourne at my office. Thank you so much for making this happen. And all of you for coming and being committed to doing this. So, and I just want to say we have delightfully a number of our scholars in the room. So we're really pleased to have a number of scholars here, as well as you having a number there. And I hope you all get a chance to speak with them later. So thank you, and I won't hold on.
All right. Well, with that, Gordon, anything you'd like to say by introduction before we take back the mic?
Well, certainly. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Gordon Flake. I'm the CEO of the Perth USAsia Center at the University of Western Australia. We ourselves are a sister organization to the American-Australian Association, a creation, if you will, in that regard. And I couldn't think of a better opportunity to collaborate, albeit electronically, with both the General Sir John Monash Foundation and American-Australian Association, than to bring together the scholars who have done some serious work on a policy issue which is of particular resonance here in Western Australia. As an economy here very much focused on the resource sector, to be able to get a rash of different perspectives on resource development in society and to be able to share it across continents, I think is a really timely topic, and we're delighted to be joining together with you. We've got a number of them here a number of the scholars here in our room here, so we'll wait to hear from your two colleagues first, and then we'll be ready to jump in with perspectives of our own.
Perfect. One last technical thing that maybe your team can help us. We are seeing the slides, but we do not have, I thought we were going to have New York on the one screen. Can you put the New York camera up on our screen for us? We've got the Sir John Monash slides and ours, but or just leave it with that. We'll leave it with that and move on. Okay, Alexander, to you, sir, take us away.
Well, thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here. So my background was that I was a AAA fellow back in 2014, and the association was generous enough to support my studies at Harvard University, where I completed a 2-year public policy course. During the course of those studies and research, I principally focused on business and government policy and relations, and particularly how you resolve significant policy disputes and negotiations with the overarching theme of sustainability. I grew up in Sydney and have a background as a commercial lawyer and currently work as a strategic negotiator at Google. And I think, with that being said, I think it's important the normal caveats that I just need to say that I sit here very much with my own public policy hat on rather than Google's. But having just last week moved across from Silicon Valley to New York, it's a really interesting time, I think, when you consider both from the extraction of resources through to the procurement and eventual consumption of resources on the scale that the companies like Google and Facebook and large technology firms do at the moment. It raises a series of policy challenges in this area, but I think also significant opportunities to work well if the circumstances present themselves with government, but also in the absence of it. If we are going to see political leaders that want to vacate this space, I think that what we're going to increasingly see and already are seeing is that private actors are willing to step up and play their part along with consumers as well. So, even though I see with my own hat on, companies like Google and others in the Valley at the moment are doing lots of very interesting things here at the moment, which I think will come to affect the way in which we think about energy, both from the consumption perspective, the consumer-facing side, and the ways in which it is produced in very significant ways in the years to come. So I've been advised to give it short, so we'll hand off with that being said.
Sure, thanks. And again, thanks for having me here too. It's great to be here. So my name is Ryan Edwards. I'm a PhD candidate in Civil Environmental Engineering at Princeton University, where I'm in the subsurface flow group, and what I do is research the environmental impacts of hydraulic fracturing or fracking, which you may have heard of more commonly. So I guess there's information in my bio about my background, but I might just give an overview of kind of my top view of what are the environmental issues around fracking. So first of all, what hydraulic fracturing is, I think, is very confusion perhaps out there. So hydraulic fracturing is a process where large amounts of water and chemicals are pumped underground to fracture rocks that have a lot of oil and or gas in them to help produce that gas and oil more easily. So about 10 years ago in the US, this technique was perfected and led to a huge explosion in oil and gas production in the United States, which obviously has since dramatically changed the energy landscape in America, and now through America starting to export oil and gas to the rest of the world is having big impacts globally on energy, oil and gas. So obviously with that there's been a lot of controversy, a lot of concern about the potential environmental impacts. So so what's new about hydraulic fracturing that concerns people is that a lot of water is injected underground, and only a very small amount of that comes back. So we lose a lot of water laced with chemicals. So what I do is computer modeling to look at where does that water end up. Does it end up somewhere safe where we're not too concerned about it, or could it potentially migrate up to groundwater aquifers? Many of the areas where fracking is done in America, there are important groundwater aquifers above the oil and gas formations. So that's the specific part I look about, but also questions we get to. There's a very broad array of questions. There's these local impacts about the water that I'm talking about. Then there's diffuse impacts that are potentially positive, that gas has substituted for a lot of coal in the US, driven by fracking. That's been a great thing. That's reduced air pollution, lowered greenhouse gas emissions. So I see kind of local negative impacts of fracking that cause concern. Then there's these diffuse positive impacts. There's definitely, that's a challenge in how we go about public policy, because negative local impacts drive a lot of resistance, but people don't necessarily see these diverse positives that fracking can bring.
Okay, on our side here, we're going to start, I believe, first with Dr. Tom Hanna and then we'll kind of move our way down the thing from Tom to Huw to Matthew, and then Jacqui and Alexa in turn. So, Tom, we'll start with you.
Great. So thanks also for having me here today. I'm rarely this excited at 7 in the morning, and I thought to share some of that excitement, I'd show you a picture of a train. So this is my job now. For my sins, and thanks to a Monash fellowship, I did a PhD in physics at Oxford Uni, and short random walk around the world later, my job is efficiency at Fortescue Metals, and in particular data-driven insights, analysing the supply chain. So it's lots of mathematics, it's lots of optimization, it's lots of analytics and data science and statistics, and it's at some level very small. We sold 900 shipments of ore last year. When we're not a multi-billion transaction company like a Google or an Amazon. But at some level, it's very, very big. My standard anecdote is that if I can save Fortescue 1 cent on every ton, that's $1.7 million over a year. So we export 170 million tons, or at least that's what we did last year. That's 5.4 tons a second, every second over the year, right? And where I work is at the interactions of all the nice big toys on the screen, right? So my 3-year-old thinks Daddy's work is cool. And so you think about working with a 240-ton truck and how we're going to put that onto a 35,000-ton train. So those trains are about 3 kilometers long. There's it's an animated slide. If you click to the next bit, that's the back of the train. In the loadout loops and dumping at Port Hedland are the only time you can see both ends of the train at once. It's just too long, right? And then we load those onto these big ships here. That's the FMG Nicola under construction. There are 2 guys standing on top of that little crane. And off an 18.8 metre draft, we lift 260,000 tonnes. It's a 327 metre long vessel with a 57 metre beam. And so my work is all about using data, using simulation and optimization to use these great big capital intensive assets as efficiently as we can, to be as efficient and cheap and fast as we can, and bring the best value that we can. So I'll also keep it brief and leave it at that.
Thank you. Huw, we'll go up to you.
Thanks. Huw Pohlner. I'm based in Melbourne and work for a water policy and management consulting firm called Aither. We're a small team that works predominantly with governments and some private businesses in managing the economic risks and political risks around water management. My background was, I was fortunate enough to receive a John Monash scholarship to study at Oxford, did a master's in human geography there. So I want to pick up on a couple of things, connect nicely with what Ryan was saying about water, and I think the connection here with energy is very strong. So as I see it, there are 3 major simple categories of challenge that we face in water resource management in the future. Too much, so flooding and extreme weather events. Too little, water scarcity, drought, and too dirty, water pollution, and some of the challenges that Ryan was mentioning with fracking. So picking up on that, I just wanted to delve a little into the idea of water scarcity and drought and how that's a challenge for the future, and what we might be able to do about it. So a couple of stats very quickly. According to the Nature Conservancy, over half the world's cities and 3/4 of all irrigated farms are experiencing water shortages on a recurring basis. The World Economic Forum has listed water crises as a top 5 global risk in terms of impact for every one of the last 6 years. And the World Bank tells us that under a business as usual water policy scenario, water scarcity could lead to declines in GDP growth across Middle East, Asia and Northern Africa of up to 6 percentage points, with obviously extreme impacts on human well-being and potentially regional stability. And of course, environmental water needs are often the first to be sacrificed. So according to the WWF, pollution and mismanagement of fresh water have contributed to an 81% decline in the abundance of freshwater species populations globally between 1970 and 2012. So big problems, big challenges. I wanted to just finish by giving you a bit of a taste of why I'm optimistic in spite of that, and where I think that through working in public policy and regulation and economics and working with communities, there are some solutions that we can put in place. Firstly, I believe that we now know what the solutions look like, whether that's improved irrigation efficiency, strengthened regulation, economic incentives for behaviour change, cost-reflective water pricing. There are a wide range of tools out there that are applicable in different scenarios. We've seen them implemented successfully in numerous countries and cities, including in the US and Australia. So that's number one. Number two, we actually only need to change the way we use water at the very margins. The majority of water we use is for agriculture, irrigated agriculture globally. In the water-scarce regions, more than 90% of water consumption goes to irrigated agriculture. So a small change in the way that we use water in agriculture can more than secure the water that we need for cities and industries. And finally, the potential benefits could be enormous. So that same World Bank study that cited the figures around 6%, potential 6 percentage point drops in GDP growth. On the flip side, with efficient water management policies in place, they project that you could see 6 to 10 percentage point growth in GDP growth. So I'll leave it at that. There's obviously a few other things I'd be interested to discuss, including focus on my own research, which was a Chinese water management infrastructure project. But that's just a bit of the framing that I'd like to leave everybody with.
Thank you. Matthew, to you.
Thank you, Huw. Thank you, Gordon. So my name's Matthew. I'm a part of a multidisciplinary energy and poverty research group at the University of Queensland. We're a little bit of a mixed bag. We've got sociologists sitting next to economists, sitting next to engineers. We recognise that this problem of energy poverty is very much multidisciplinary and needs a very sort of transdisciplinary sort of solution. So I've been very lucky to be supported by the American Australian Association to spend 6 months at Washington University in St. Louis to collaborate with some very, very smart, very intelligent leading scientists that are looking at this problem from that perspective. My background's in policy, energy policy, and then I've moved into more of a sociology sort of space with my PhD research. I've recognised that some of the human dimensions and the social dimensions seem to fall away by the wayside in very much policy discussions of late. So I've been pursuing this lens to bring that back into policy. So I've just included several illustrations because I believe that these can speak a lot louder about this problem than what I ever could. So you can see in the background there's transmission lines, the depiction of the modern economy, modern society in terms of energy development. And these transmission lines stretch as far as the eye can see. But in the foreground we've got a small rural farmer in India who continues to use traditional means of the ox cart, ploughing and sowing his crops. So there's very much a dichotomy or a duality about energy development, particularly in this part of the world. But as there are structural inequalities within countries, there's also across countries. And so you can see on the graph the way that we use energy in terms of the OECD average, the US and Australia, in terms of energy use per capita is by far much more than what some of these people in the least developed countries in India provide. And so we've seen this transition, this typical way of development from basic access moving through to sufficiency in modern life, and then in some cases over to excessive consumption. So at the moment there's still 1 billion people across the world that still do not have access to electricity, and then there's 3 billion who still do not have access to clean cooking fuels. And what this means is that there's in India alone, there's 65% of the population, 2 out of every 3 people, continue to use solid fuel wood for cooking purposes. What that means is there's a drudgery on modern life, on the day-to-day life. Also brings ill health. And I've included this photo down the bottom taken from rural India of one of the kitchens, and just looking at that image makes my eyes start to water just from the memory of being there. So move on to the next slide, please. So part of this challenge is about geography in some of these more remote communities. The question is, how do we supply and ensure technology is reached to those most in need? And so technology advance has helped us along that way, but there's still much more that we need to do in terms of making sure these technologies are affordable and accessible to those most in need. And finally, this is a photo taken from, I've been very lucky to spend 6 months in Nepal looking at how energy has supported these communities after the earthquake in 2015. Sadly, there's still much more work that needs to be done in Nepal since the earthquake. These people are still recovering. They still need our support. But on the flip side of that, what I've seen is just the profound difference that just being able to rely on some of the most basic services, such as lighting, clean cooking, and heating as well, that these people can rely upon. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Jacqui, over to you.
Hi, my name's Jacqui Baker. That's my selfie with former President SBY from Indonesia, taken in an event that Gordon very kindly hosted, and I try and show that selfie off whenever I can because I'm so proud of it. I'm a political economist. I'm based at the Asia Research Centre at Murdoch University. And my work is probably conceives of resources in a totally different way than the other people at this table and over there in New York. Can we flip to the next slide? So for me, this is a resource. For you, that might look like a dingy old building. It's in the north of Jakarta. It's an abandoned warehouse left by the colonial regime. It was a warehouse for shipping. But in certain periods of Indonesia's history, this warehouse has been a multi-million-dollar casino, an illegal casino operating like many other illegal casinos in the city, under the kind of out of the sort of operating illegally, but producing tens of millions of dollars a day. And so my work, much like Matthew's, involves a lot of trekking around, talking to people, but not in villages and so forth, but in bars and in the kind of dingy sides of the city that we often ignore. Now, I don't do this just for fun. I don't think I do this in order to understand the relationship between economic systems and political systems. And what do I mean by that? By that I mean that economic systems have sort of bases to their economies, and that those have produced certain kinds of political structures. And I ask the question, well, if some bases to the economies are illegal, what kinds of political structures do these produce? So I look at these kind of gambling dens, drug economies, areas that we think of as beyond the reach of the state, and I see how that they are embedded as part of the state and how they produce certain kinds of political elites and political structures over time. So it's a really different kind of understanding of resources, I guess, but I'm asking you through this research to kind of flip your understanding of what is criminal and what is illegal and see it as well embedded as part of our political and economic and social structures.
Thank you very much. Alexa?
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Morning there in New York. My name's Alexa Morcombe, and my role is I'm the Government and Community Group Manager at Fortescue Metals Group. And back to the more traditional form of resources, as Tom indicated, we're an iron ore miner based in the Pilbara region of Western Australia, which is the very north of this state. And I completed an EMBA at the end of 2015, and my area of interest is really around, I guess, how business and the role that business can play in addressing really chronic social issues and being a positive agent for social change. And for resource companies, this is particularly important as the role, as I guess our role within the communities where we operate. So in the Pilbara region, Aboriginal people or Indigenous people who live there suffer rates of disadvantage that are extremely significant, and in fact they're probably some of the more disadvantaged people in the developed world. That means that rates of educational outcomes are lower, lower life expectancy, employment outcomes, high suicide rates, and other factors. So when we started our operation, our founder, Andrew Forrest, was of the view that in the past, mining has been operating in the Pilbara for many years, since the 1950s, and really the paradigm for Aboriginal people hasn't shifted, despite the fact that, that the resources industry is really the powerhouse of the Australian economy. And this is also despite the fact that in the early 1990s, or since that time, there have been many large agreements concluded between Aboriginal people and mining companies that have seen, many millions of dollars paid into trust, yet still this, this disadvantage remains in these communities. So really I've been focused in my work at Fortescue over the last 11 years on how can we contribute to trying to change this issue. And so what we did was really look first at saying, okay, well, we're going to have to challenge the status quo here. If we're going to do the same thing as everybody else, then nothing's going to change. So we just said, well, we don't think more money is the answer here. We really want to focus on making sure that Aboriginal people have access to the opportunities that our business creates. So our focus has been on training and employing Aboriginal people, and also making sure that we contribute to creating Aboriginal businesses. So we set ourselves some pretty high targets. In the early days of Fortescue, we set a target of employing, that we wanted our workforce to be 20% Aboriginal. And Aboriginal people make up 3% of Australia's population, and in the Pilbara they're probably between 10 and 15% of the population. But we thought, no, we really want to set ourselves a stretch target here. And everyone said at the time, well, that's probably impossible. A lot of these people, you won't be able to employ them. They haven't had access to the same education, literacy levels are lower, etc. So we came up with a strategy for looking at, well, what are the barriers that these people face and why can't they get a job? And then just setting up a training program that really focused in on the individual, on that person, and on the job that they had to do at the end of the day. So over the past 10 years, that program's been operating, and we now employ between us and our contractors, over 1,300 Aboriginal people, which is around 15.5% of our workforce, and we're on the way to meet our target of 20% by 2020. And then in 2011, after a little bit of criticism from some of the Aboriginal people that we work with, they said, well, Fortescue, you're employing a lot of Aboriginal people, but you're not doing enough about creating businesses. So we thought, okay, well, what can we do here? We'll apply the same approach, and we set a very, a challenging target of awarding $1 billion to Aboriginal businesses within 2 years. We were going through a very big construction phase at this time. So what we did here was we looked and said, okay, we really need to change our procurement processes. What's stopping Aboriginal businesses from engaging with us? And how can we build capacity and capability in these businesses? And we looked to partner them up with our existing contractors and really develop those relationships. And then I guess the third factor was really just making sure that the opportunities were available for these businesses. And so within 18 months, 6 months early, we'd reached our target of awarding $1 billion, and today we've awarded over $1.8 billion to Aboriginal businesses, and that's over to 100 different businesses. So I guess these examples to me show how business can play a really strong role in creating and contributing to addressing really challenging social issues. And some of the things I think that are key to that process is really being able to, or being prepared as a business to challenge the status quo, which I think is not easy and always that acceptable for businesses. To put yourself out there and set some really, I guess, stretch targets in order to make a difference. And then thirdly, to apply, I guess, a real business approach to this. So looking within the strengths of your business to see what you can contribute to a particular social issue, I guess, rather than maybe trying to replace government or take a more philanthropic approach. So yeah, that's a basic rundown on what I've been working on. So.
Well, if you're like me, after hearing these 7 different presentations, on the one hand, you're alarmed by the enormity of the challenges that we face globally in this sector. On the other hand, you can't help but be inspired and hopeful by the caliber of individuals and thinking that has been supported by the General Sir John Monash Foundation and by AAA in terms of focusing on this. We here in Western Australia are being served breakfast right now, but we have an opportunity to, while we're eating, to share some initial discussions. And I thought I might kick off with an initial question for all the 7 panelists to chime into if they want to. And then we have a smaller audience here in Perth than you've got in New York, but it's more than made up for in quality what we lack in quantity. I should have acknowledged at the very beginning our hosts at PwC, who kindly hosting us early this morning, but we've also got the president of the Fogarty Fellows here, as well as a former vice chancellor of the university and others, and so we should have a good discussion and round. And if I could kick it off, about a year ago, we hosted a scholar from Washington, D.C., named Marcus Nolan, who had written a book called The Resource Curse. And he was focusing on the challenges, primarily in the developing world, about how you deal with an abundance of natural resources, and really focusing on the economic and the governance challenges that came with it. Between AAA and the Sir John Monash Foundation, the scholars here represent some remarkable thinking in Australia and the United States, and yet there are probably no two better countries better poised to deal with these challenges of resources in society than Australia and the United States. So the question, which several of our panelists have already started to address, I would like to throw out to the panel at the beginning is, how does Australia and the United States, or how do Australia and the United States, make sure that the legal, cultural, ethical foundation that we have in our governments, in our societies, in our corporations for dealing with resource issues, benefit the developing world, benefit the other parts of the world where many of those resources lie and where many of those challenges lie. So with that, I think I would just open it up to any of our panelists. Maybe we'll start in New York as well. If either of you have a reaction to that, then we'll turn to our panelists back here while they continue to eat their breakfast, and then we'll open it up to a broader question. So our colleagues in New York, do we have anything from either Alexander or Ryan?
Yeah, I think it's a huge question, and also given the diversity of sort of issues that we just touched on there, I'm conscious that we might not find an end just to that one alone in the time we've got. But I think the two things that strike me is that the two considerations that I think should drive an answer, or any answer in this space, has to be considerations of distributional effects of where the benefits are going to across borders, and the second has to be sustainability. And I think if you consider, even just developments in the last 7 days and on the last piece, that there is an obligation on us to think about how, as we share resources, as we share technologies, we have to have a sustainability lens applied. We looked at the sort of different energy consumption patterns across a couple of different regions earlier on, just a couple of minutes ago. That doesn't necessarily point, in my view, to it can't be a matching exercise one for one. We need to ask ourselves, well, how do we get to a sustainable point? And I think that brings us to the distributional piece of this, and it is on, I think governments and the private sector to work together to ensure that technologies are distributed into other jurisdictions, to ensure that when we think about production of clean energy, when we think about distribution of technologies that can connect to the internet, to have at the local level micro improvements, to Tom's point, that when scaled together can make significant differences both to the individual consumers and to households as they continue to develop, but also to the broader sustainability picture more generally. And I think in the absence of either of those two broad considerations, it makes the cross-border challenge incredibly difficult, and I would say not sustainable.
Thank you. Ryan, anything?
I don't have anything specific to add. I don't think right now. I'm happy to throw it back over to you guys.
Very good. So any of our colleagues here in Perth want to take on that, again, admittedly kind of broad question? And just have at it. So.
Yeah, well, I guess just a very, very general point about predictability for business investments. So in the social license under which you operate can sort of change around you over the several years that it takes to raise capital and construct a mining operation or energy, and then once you've built it, you're going to operate for a long, long time. And in these days, you're going to operate with an increasing level of automation. And so you're right. It's about having those predictable both business cultures and political cultures that enable decisions to be made several years ahead. Whereas in developing countries, that can be even more of a challenge. You don't know what the landscape's going to be like in 5 years. You'll raise capital at a much higher rate. And every decision you make is made with that much greater level of uncertainty around it.
Other comments? Jacqui?
Yeah, I mean, I think the question needs to be, although we understand the principles of what that relationship should produce, which would be distributed benefits, sustainability, the question, as Tom correctly identified, is, well, what are the political institutions and social institutions that would produce a decision-making mechanism wherein those kinds of goals can be achieved? And perhaps this is where Alexa can weigh in, because you have this is the kinds of work that you do. You establish these kinds of institutions wherein different kinds of communities can come together and talk about the distributional effects of work.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that it is a real challenge, I guess, talking on behalf of a resource business as we consider operating in other jurisdictions. Predominantly, Fortescue's, all of our operations are located in Australia, but we do have, we are looking at expanding, and so, in considering where we do that, looking at developing countries. And I think that, the resources industry can potentially can have both a very positive benefit to those communities in those countries, but also have a very, I guess, if not done correctly, very negative benefit on those smaller, communities located in proximity to a mining operation. So I think that it has to be really, all those factors have to be really, I guess, weighed very closely when thinking about it, and how you can actually do that and take for us as a business, I guess, take what we've done here and how we've been able to operate and achieve, and make sure that that we can do the same thing and have a positive impact on those communities. But it's weighing up all the different factors and it includes the the political and the local community, as well as the economic.
Established with the, say, Indigenous communities. I guess there would be maybe a model. It seems to be such a productive model.
Yeah, and I think that it really comes to as a company saying, okay, well, in Australia we might have, I guess the rules and the laws and the systems, etc., and how we've developed based on that all of our processes which comply with that, which also go above that, and then being prepared to take that model and apply it in a country where necessarily those systems and things don't necessarily operate. You've almost got to bring that standard of engaging with communities and going over and above what the law might require or the law in a particular place requires, but to make sure that that now we're very much mindful of our obligations. We're a signatory to the United Nations Global Compact for Business, so really thinking about human rights and all those much broader issues, and then how we can operate within a particular country.
So I would note here that I share with Tom's son, the excitement over the whiz-bang part of big trains and trucks and boats and the high technology involved there. And there's often a focus here in Western Australia about the exportability of Australian technology that has been developed to a remarkable degree over the last 2 decades in the resource sector in Australia. But perhaps the most important export coming out of Australia is precisely what Alexa and Jacqui were just talking about. It is those processes, those standards, those norms, those things that have benefited both in the United States and Australia from the legal tradition we inherited and the social contract in which those things take place. And so an interesting way to look at the issue that kind of ties in together the many presentations we have. We've only got about 15 minutes left, John, and I want to be aware of the remarkable audience you've got there. We'd welcome some questions you might have from your audience there, and then I'll turn the mic to the audience here for some questions we have here.
Let's turn to our New York audience. We also have some potential questions coming in. Okay, nothing from Facebook yet, but let's go to New York live here. Any questions that you have for our scholars?
If not, I've got plenty. Okay, any of our colleagues here from our Perth audience have anything you want to ask the panel, or I'll jump right into it? Anne, we'll turn it over. Let me give you the microphone if I could. We've got Anne Fogarty here.
I know it's probably small in the global scale of things, but is anyone looking at renewable urban resources, like taking waste and turning that into energy? That's if that can be looked at, that's a win-win, I would think.
Any of our panelists aware of work on that front or working on it yourself?
I'm certainly aware of I'm certainly aware of the problems, particularly in places like Kathmandu, Delhi, other parts of India that certainly need a solution like that. So it's an excellent question. I know some colleagues, some of the great NGOs that are working in these sort of urban spaces, but I think that's an excellent question and something that I would like to see definitely happen a little bit more.
Can I take the opportunity to turn back a little bit more specifically on the question of water? Because there isn't a resource sector, and actually there probably isn't a single one of the presentations that we had today that isn't directly tied into kind of water more broadly. And so I was wondering if, having had kind of a deep dive looking at fracking specifically, if our other colleagues would kind of talk about how the availability of water, whether it is in the mining sector, whether it is in social contracts, whether it is in countries like Indonesia, kind of how does that factor into your thinking in the presentation you made of the research you're working on that front? So, and again, back to our colleagues as well as in New York. So.
Sure, I can just add a little bit on considerations of water and fracking, and it's a huge issue. So the fundamental basis of fracking is injecting a lot of water into the ground. So something like 20 million litres into each well, which is 20 Olympic pools into one well, and thousands of wells. And meeting with people in the fracking industry here, a direct quote is, we're not really in the oil and gas business, we're really in the water business. Oil and gas is something just associated that comes along with dealing with water. And the United States has been very lucky in a lot of the big areas of fracking. There's good water availability. But in other parts of the world, that is a huge constraint on the ability to extract these resources. So in China, there are some excellent potential formations for hydraulic fracturing to get oil and gas out of the ground. But they're in the west of China, there's very little water availability, and it's really kind of, I think, about up there with the most fundamental constraints on being able to access that energy resource. So, yeah, I just echo again that energy and water go hand in hand. They're very interrelated in every way you look at energy and every way you look at water.
Tom, could we turn to you? People think mining and rocks, but the reality is your job involves an awful lot to do with water as well.
Fortescue moves more water every year than Water Corporation. We drain the entire Swan River twice by volume over a year. We mine entirely, sorry.
Yeah, the third, I think there's only one mine in the world that moves more water than we do at one of our operations.
We're mining entirely below the water table, right? So we have to dewater and pause, re-inject elsewhere where it's safe. Also, we wash our rocks. It's all except one of our ore processing facilities are wet. So the rocks are washed on the way in, separates out some of the clay, and then we pull the high iron content out of that using gravitational separation in a cyclone. Because the ships go out with about 8% water in them, we're also one of Australia's largest water exporters, although we don't get paid for the water, unfortunately. So yeah, water considerations are huge. We have a large hydrology team and hydrogeology team. You also need to understand how the water is going to flow on the surface if you want to dig a big hole in the ground or put up a big railway, which is a huge flood barrier. So even if you're building a railway on level ground, it has to be 1 metre up so that you can have a 60 centimetre culvert underneath. So yeah, we think about water all the time.
Thank you. Any other comments or insights from either a community or other specific perspective?
Well, I think sorry. I was just going to say, I think it ties back quite well into the previous question around, what do we have, I guess, in Australia and the US that potentially benefits the developing world? Because I think that, that management of water resources associated with resource extraction is all the more pressing when mining in developing nations. So I think that technology and that innovation really needs to be applied across the board.
Good.
Yeah, I think what everybody's really picking up on is just the importance of water, and I think one of the things that we're seeing in working with some firms in the extractive industries is really understanding the difference between the cost of water to that business and the value of water. So the cost in many instances might be very low, but the value is often extremely high. So when you start to think about it in that way, and when you think about water at the basin scale and some of the policy risks associated with policy change at the basin scale and other users in that basin, then managing water in the extractive industries becomes very tricky and very high risk. So I think companies are starting to really realize that now.
Let me take another question. And again, yes, go ahead, John. Go ahead.
Anne-Marie had a quick comment.
I know it may be a little bit contentious to say this, but I do want to say, in all this conversation around water and the value to business and the need and the importance of it to business and the huge volumes of water being used, just coming back to the notion of society, where in that story is there the consideration of how this water usage is impacting on society, both the use of it and then what happens to the water after it's provided the resource or helped to release the oil or the gas. So I can't imagine I'm not the only person in the room with that question in your mind. So I'm interested in what all of you who are the experts in that field can say about that.
Well, please, go ahead, Huw. Or?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. The part of thinking about, working with mining companies and seeing them start to increasingly not think about water at just the facility scale. So like, here's an individual mine, we need this much water every day, and this much comes out the other end as a waste product or something. That's not really appropriate in a context where that water is bound within a basin or an aquifer, and there are a number of other users of that water. So yeah, it's very important to think about, I mean, what I kind of haven't really touched on too much yet is the politics of all this. And I mean, the politics of water use are often, when we saw in the Murray-Darling Basin over on the east coast of Australia over 20, 30 years of reform recently, how often, despite the government mobilising large sums of money, the sticking points around changing the way we deal with water often tended to come down to politics, local politics, community politics, and many extractive industries firms see that every day. So yeah, I mean, that needs to be taken seriously, and as Tom kind of intimated before, there's a huge risk of losing the license to operate because you fail to take into account other users of water in these areas.
Other comments, either in New York or other panelists on that, the social implications?
I would add, from New York, in the western part of the United States, the eastern part where Brian's working is water is more plentiful, but in our west is a scarcer resource. There's an old line that goes with whiskey is for drinking and water is for fighting. And it captures that the scarcity of that resource is one that goes back hundreds of years in the United States, and it's clearly tied up in many of these issues as well, and the trade-offs that exist between industry, agriculture, urban, and wildlife is a very tough competition in the western part of our country.
So let me build on this topic, and again, I realize, with apologies to our panelists, I'm asking some 50,000-foot questions when you're given some very specific presentations. But I think one advantage of having a group of 7 scholars looking at from different perspectives is we might give different views on some of the bigger issues. Huw mentioned in his presentation that one of the challenges for resources more broadly is that the benefits are felt very diffusely, right? I mean, the world as a whole, in terms of our economy and production and jobs, benefits tremendously from the iron ore boom that's taken place in Western Australia. China certainly has. It's led to a lot of opportunity, a lot of development, a lot of jobs. Likewise, lower energy prices is a major driver behind the United States economy right now. It's something that the region as a whole depends on. And yet those benefits are diffuse. They go across the society writ large. The costs be that in water, be they local community issues, et cetera, tend to be felt in a very focused manner. And therein lies one of the fundamental challenges of this sector, is how do you move forward on issues where the costs are localized and very acute, and the people focusing on those costs are very passionate, understandably, and yet people are not as passionate about the broader benefits. And I would just note that this is a broader discussion that applies to free trade. The benefits are very broad and diffuse, and so it's difficult to get people energized about it, but the costs are very acute, and people get very energized about the costs. That makes sense. And so when you think about resources more broadly, from any of our panelists' perspectives, how do you deal with that tension between diffuse benefits and localized costs? Alexa?
I think that I guess the approach is, and it's a particularly pertinent question here at the moment in Western Australia. There's been quite a debate around, the broader community desire to sort of increase, the taxes paid by the big mining companies, despite the many, millions and billions paid in resources and taxes, and I think part of that agitation around this issue here locally in Western Australia has come from a perception in the communities where mining is operating in the Pilbara that in fact, people are feeling like, well, are we really benefiting from this? This is happening here in our backyard. And so I think that, companies really always have to be mindful of, yes, there is that broader benefit, but where you operate is, should be a number one priority in terms of responding to those communities and making sure the people that are impacted get the positives, because there is such an opportunity for positives, particularly in remote areas where there aren't access to jobs, etc. For development of local businesses, there's a lot of opportunity there, but companies have to be very focused on that.
Fantastic. Other thoughts from our panelists? Jacqui, go ahead.
I guess I would reframe perhaps the way you're talking about the issue. I mean, you're talking about sort of diffuse benefits to society and small numbers of people bearing the costs of it. And I think we have to start, I prefer, I guess, to frame it in terms of an unequal distribution of benefits. And I think we need to understand and come at it from an understanding that these things do have, that benefits of these processes and of these economies are unequally distributed. They're not diffuse and small, it's unequal across. And then if we start from that premise, then we start talking about, well, how do we balance out those inequalities?
Makes sense.
Yeah, I think it's a great point that Jacqui raises, and I think, in the point where if you can concentrate potentially on some of the load being borne by those instances where benefits are highly concentrated, and I think Google is a good example here. For example, just this year, the company made a commitment to this year's source all energy for data centers and operations from renewable resources, and there's no sort of policy level or political mechanism that's been applied for that. But I think that this is a good example of, because benefits in terms of what comes from the services and the internet are highly concentrated within Google, that the push to invest in things like renewable sources of energy, to engage in highly complicated and expensive mechanisms to do that through things like power purchase agreements, those costs are also highly concentrated now by an actor like Fortescue, in terms of promotion of jobs and opportunity in the regions within which it operates, but also by companies like Google, by companies like Facebook, by companies like Apple, who also want to have chosen to concentrate some of the costs back on themselves as well. So when you think about the distribution of both those benefits and costs, I think that there are opportunities both for policymakers, but also for private actors to think about the appropriate allocation of those roles and responsibilities. Because if they end up, as we sort of alluded to throughout the last hour or so, if they end up becoming too concentrated and spread out in other ways, then the distributional effects and inequality that result is not sustainable.
Gordon, we have a question here from our audience in New York.
One thing to consider is the long-term versus the short-term. Namely, short-term, of course, there'll be production of oil and not too much damage. But long term, the loss of the water may be a factor. How do you equate? But of course, normally, both the politicians and businessmen are looking for the now, not like what's going to be 10 years from now. How to equate the two is a challenge.
Now, let me just clarify, John. Do we have to wrap up right at 8 o'clock? Is that correct?
Yeah, I think we do, Gordon. We can stretch it a few minutes, but maybe we get the questions out and we can at least answer them via email on our websites if we can't get to the full answer with the group. What's your other question?
Exactly on that point of the long term versus the short term, something I was thinking about as I was hearing from all the panelists was things like the withdrawal of the US from the Paris Climate Accord this week. Does that open up a greater role for the companies and organisations that you're all working within? And how do you envisage the role of these companies and organisations in managing resources in a way that will balance out some of that kind of political change?
Well, thank you. I realize that there's still a lot of potential issues out there. You know, I would note that Matthew's presentation talking about the remaining energy needs that are out there. So on the one hand, we can, sitting in the relative comfort of New York and Perth, think that we've got all the resources we need, and yet at the same time, you've got a good chunk of population in the world that doesn't even have basic energy for cooking. So that gives you a sense of the remaining tensions in the field. Do we have any final kind of short comments from our panelists? Anything you wanted to add that we haven't had a chance to add yet? Well, if not, again, I want to make sure we extended our thanks here in Perth to our hosts at PwC and our absolute delight at the caliber of scholarships that is come out of the fellowships provided by both the General Sir John Monash Foundation and the American Australian Association. So from Perth, we really appreciate it, and we'll turn it back to you in New York for some final comments that you might have.
I would just ask for everyone's help. This is our first attempt at this, and we would like to repeat it and follow up and do a better job as we learn, as we go forward. There's some ideas already I think our team has been coming up with as they've gotten ready for this. But if something occurred to you tonight that would make things better for the future, just zap us an email or go on our website and feed that back to us. We would really appreciate it, so that we'll hope to get better and better at this, and especially as we adjust with the technology. It's amazing to me the real-time nature that we've been able to do. Perth is as far as you can go from New York City before you start to come back around the plant. It is literally antipode in New York. So it's amazing to me that this has worked as well as it has tonight, and thank you for your patience. And Marie?
Look, again, I just would like to say thank you so much to everyone for making the commitment to supporting this our inaugural forum, and also to thank PwC for their support, and also very much the lovely friend of Jalen who actually was the stand-in PwC representative. Thanks to her as well. I feel like the conversation's just started to warm up. It feels like we're now really ready to get into a deep dive discussion. So that's frustrating, but it's also a really good sign, and it will help us also to think about our design as well. So is there anything else, anyone's burning desire to comment before we say good night and good morning? Last chance, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. So well, and look forward to your comments and feedback.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, everybody here. The sky is blue, and it's 70 degrees outside. Come to Perth.
Thanks,
Yesterday.